If ethical theory is about what is good and evil, right and wrong for human beings, then it is inevitable that every system of ethics is going to have to include some sort of account of pleasure and pain. After all, pleasure and pain certainly have to figure into any account of good and evil and what happiness and happiness are going to involve. So then what are pleasure and pain? How are we to define and explain them? Perhaps we might define pain as the absence or negative counterpart of pleasure. But then how are we to define pleasure? This is something that it is notoriously difficult to do. It is extremely hard to say even what ontological category pleasure should fall into. We might be tempted to say that pleasure is a feeling. But even that is ambiguous. What does feeling mean? Does it mean a sensation, like the sensation of red, or the taste of an orange, or the feeling of rubbing your fingers over sandpaper? Or does it mean a feeling in the sense of an emotion, like love or hate or sexual attraction? These, of course, are very different. The sensation of red may be associated by one person with hate. For example, seeing red, of course, this is a metaphor for anger as well, but seeing red may make a political right-winger think of communists. But for another, it might cause sexual arousal even. Red lipstick turns me on, someone might think. So very different things to have an emotion versus having a sensation. These are not the same things. One person might associate love with the taste of an orange. Another might hate the taste of an orange and associate hate with it. So even feeling is ambiguous. If pleasure is a feeling, which of these categories of feeling is it? Sensation, emotion, or some combination of both? That's not clear. But it's not clear that pleasure even is a feeling. Our language certainly suggests other possibilities. We say that we take pleasure in something. We take pleasure in something. For example, I may actually take pleasure in reading Aristotle if I'm a strange sort of person. So let's say I do take pleasure in reading Aristotle. Sometimes I do. But I wouldn't say that this taking pleasure in involves any sort of sensation in particular. There are sensations involved. You know, there's the visual sensation of the black letters on a white page, a sensation of mental concentration. But taking pleasure in Aristotle is distinct from that. In fact, the taking pleasure in Aristotle might even be accompanied by a kind of pain at the same time. Those same sensations of seeing the white or the black letters on white paper or mental concentration, those have also existed when I've graded many a article or book or student paper in which pleasure was utterly absent. So clearly the taking pleasure in was not a sensation. Was it an emotion? Well, if I were more confident that I knew what an emotion was, perhaps I could answer that question. But it certainly was very distinct from the emotions of love or hate or sexual attraction. One wants to say that at least in some cases, taking pleasure in is closer to a kind of attitude, like believing something or doubting it or approving or disapproving. But what is an attitude? Finally, we can describe activities as pleasures. For example, a conversation over coffee at a cafe. Your conversational partner might say to you, "Hey, thanks for meeting me." And it would be natural for you to respond, "It was a pleasure." Well, what is the it here when I say, "It was a pleasure"? What was the it? Not a sensation, not an emotional feeling or attitude. It here refers to the whole meeting itself and all of its attendant activities, especially the activity of having a conversation. Similarly, one might describe a dinner party or a vacation as a pleasure. Thus, it seems that activity might also be a candidate for what a pleasure is. course, we might be thinking now that the word pleasure is what Aristotle might describe as an equivocal term, that is, one used in different senses. But first, it's not clear that this is the case, and even if it is, there's still a question whether there's a primary sense from which the others have evolved or been derived. Now, different ethicists will have different needs and uses for an account of pleasure. In Aristotle's case, the main need seems to be to integrate the popular, albeit vulgar, idea that the happiest life is the life of gratification, to integrate that position with his own position that the happiest life is the life of virtue, which will have to encompass the life of study as well, as we've already hinted. We've already seen hinted at, I should say, in Book 1, and we'll continue to see this developed at the end of Book 10. Aristotle has suggested in various places that there is no fundamental conflict or incompatibility between the pleasant life and the virtuous cum studious life. There's no fundamental conflict or incompatibility between those. However, this proposition is far from obvious, and certainly the masses, the hoi polloi, would tend to dispute it. Here, I think, is where the need for a detailed philosophical account of what pleasure is comes in. For it might be the case that the many and the wise are conceiving of pleasure in different ways. In particular, we might suspect that Aristotle believes that the many think that there is an incompatibility between the life of pleasure and the life of virtue, cum study, only because they, the majority, have a confused understanding of what pleasure really is. So in order to cement his account of happiness and his ethical theory as a whole, Aristotle will need to provide a more adequate theory of pleasure that reveals their compatibility. It's a well-known and much disputed fact about Aristotle's theory of pleasure that it appears to be divided into two separate and apparently divergent accounts. Those with a temperament more suited to classical philology are often tempted to explain the duplication of the account of pleasure in the text of the Nicomachean Ethics, as we have inherited it, as an editing mistake, or at least a questionable decision on the part of whoever assembled Aristotle's text, who may have been the Nicomachean of the title, although we don't really know. That's one theory of why this is called the Nicomachean Ethics, is that Nicomachean was the editor. However, the more philosophically inclined tend to be intrigued by the fact that the two different accounts of pleasure bracket Aristotle's account of friendship, and might wonder whether this is or isn't a coincidence. Although the amount of text that deals with the theory of friendship is much longer than the amount of text that deals with pleasure, could it be possible to read the account of friendship as, in part, a long digression from the account of pleasure? Could it be that the first half of the theory of pleasure raises issues that could only be adequately dealt with following a long excursus on the nature of the way that pleasure is found in friendship? This is an intriguing possibility, I think. The advantage of reading the account of friendship as an excursus or digression from the account of pleasure is that it allows us to maintain the integrity of Aristotle's text and the continuity of his argument, which I believe are highly desirable objectives, all things equal. So let us try out the hermeneutic hypothesis, the interpretive hypothesis, that there is one consistent and continuous account of pleasure that is interrupted by the account of friendship, because that account represents a necessary digression that's needed in order to place on the table some considerations that are essential to completing that account. What results if we read the text this way? So let's turn to the first account of pleasure, which is in Book 7, following the account of incontinence. beginning chapter 11 of book 7, page 134. Now, it seems appropriate that we would talk about pleasure at this point because incontinence, of course, as we've seen, is concerned with one of the main ways in which pleasure can become ethically problematic. The way in which the allure or attraction of bodily pleasures, in particular the pleasures of taste and touch, can lead one to go against one's principles, ethically speaking. And so to look at exactly what gives pleasure the ability to do this and how this might be counteracted is going to be a topic of interest to ethicists. However, we should note that incontinence only involves a quite narrow range of the types of pleasure, namely the pleasures of touch and taste. It's only at the end, actually, that Aristotle gives an indication that this account of pleasure has any specific connection to his account of incontinence. At first, it appears to be a completely new beginning, insofar as he begins to offer a ground-up explanation and defense of why the political philosopher should be concerned with pleasure and pain. So he says, page 134, pleasure and pain are proper subjects of study for the political philosopher, since he is the ruling craftsman of the end that we refer to in calling something good or bad without qualification. Further, we must also examine them because we have laid it down that virtue and vice of character are about pains and pleasures, and because most people think happiness involves pleasure. This is why they also call the blessed person by that name, Makarios, from enjoyment, Charai. So Aristotle first lays out three justifications for considering pleasure and pain in a work that has the particular aims of the Nicomachean ethics. First, he says, the political philosopher is the leading craftsman of unqualified good or bad ends. What the relevance of that is left sort of implicit, but one might think, well, pleasure and pain are included among such ends, or such ends are potentially opposed to pleasure and pain, but whatever it is, that's the first consideration he raises. The political philosopher is the leading craftsman of unqualified good and bad ends. Second, most agree that the highest good or unqualified end, which is happiness, involves pleasure in some way. And third, virtue and vice of character involve pleasures and pains. Next, Aristotle begins his inquiry into pleasure and pain by considering what is said about them and common beliefs about them. So, kind of his standard methodology. We're going to inquire into an area. Let's first consider what people say about them, what people say about these things. And he considers, though, negative common opinions or doxa, which suggests that he is, in fact, now responding to the theory of incontinence that he has just gone through, because that theory is going to naturally give rise to negative opinions about pleasure. And so this is what he focuses on, the negative opinions about pleasure and the relation of pleasure and the good. And there are basically three degrees here of opinion about pleasure and the good. The first, the most extreme anti-pleasure view would be that no pleasure is a good, because the good is not the same thing as pleasure. The good is one thing, pleasure is another thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that pleasure is evil. It just means that pleasure is not good. It could be neutral too. But on this view, no pleasure is a good. The second is that some pleasures are good, but that most are bad. So there's still an anti-pleasure view, but not quite as extreme as the first. Some pleasures are good, but most are bad. And third, even if pleasures are good, the best good still cannot be pleasure. So those are sort of the three doxa, or opinions, common beliefs that he considers. No pleasure is a good because the good's not the same thing as pleasure. Some pleasures are good, but most are bad. And even if pleasures are good, the best good cannot be a pleasure. And again, as I've suggested, we can see here a natural outgrowth of the just completed study of incontinence. If that study suggested that pleasure is the enemy of the ethical life, or at least an obstacle to the pursuit of the good, here Aristotle is, as it were, acknowledging the opinions that arise from that apparent conclusion, taking up the various degrees of the opinion, from the most extreme view that no pleasure whatsoever is good, to progressively weaker views. Some are good and some aren't. Perhaps most or the majority are good, but at least the very best good is not pleasure. Aristotle goes on then to offer a compendium of general anti-pleasure arguments from general abstract philosophical considerations. For example, the argument that pleasure is a perceived becoming towards an end. This is the theory of pleasure as a becoming, as a process that he will consider throughout his theory of pleasure as kind of the main competitor to his theory. So pleasure is the first general philosophical argument that is opposed to pleasure, says pleasure is a perceived becoming towards an end. But no becoming is equivalent to the end. The good must be the end, not the becoming. So he considers that. We'll come back to that in a minute. But also he considers more practical general considerations, such as pleasures impede prudent thinking. Prudent thinking here, we should think of moral reasoning. Pleasure muddies up your moral reasoning. It prevents you from seeing clearly what the moral issues are and deliberating correctly about those moral issues. And so it's better to avoid them altogether. That would be more of a practical consideration against pleasure. On a less extreme level, people will cite certain pleasures thought to be shameful and harmful as a proof that not all pleasures are good. Kind of guilt by association view. So Aristotle's task then is to sort through these various negative opinions about pleasure and determine their validity, which he does beginning chapter 12. And we immediately come to see here one likely purpose of his taking up a discussion of pleasure at this point in the Nicomachean ethics. He's well aware of how the phenomenon of incontinence can sour people's opinions about pleasure, perhaps even leading them to denounce it altogether and refuse to acknowledge that it is any good at all. And this seems to be the animus behind some of the negative opinions he just cited. However, Aristotle does not believe that we should draw such an extreme negative conclusion from the discussion of incontinence. So he wants to guard against that. He's saying that's not me. That's not my view. I'm not saying that because incontinence is a thing, that therefore pleasure is to be denounced and rejected. He seems particularly concerned to show the fallaciousness of the general abstract philosophical argument against pleasure that says because pleasure is a becoming or a process, it cannot be a good. So let's lay out that argument more clearly, and we can write this out because it's pretty short. So this argument is something like this. The first premise would be all goods are ends. All goods are ends. We've seen the association of the good or goods with an end from the very beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics in Book 1. The second premise would say that pleasures are not ends. And the evidence for this is that they are becomings. And the idea of a becoming is that it is a process leading to an end. Therefore distinct from it. And therefore not an end. And then this leads us to the conclusion. Pleasures are not goods. So this is the argument that in both of his accounts of pleasure in different forms, Aristotle shows a concern to counter. All goods are ends. Pleasures are not ends because pleasures are becomings. and therefore pleasures are not good. And so it's the second premise, which contains a particular theory of pleasure, that pleasure is a becoming, that Aristotle seems most concerned to dispute and to offer an alternative to in his theory of pleasure. Now, initially here, Aristotle's reply to this argument is, unfortunately, highly complex, convoluted, and obscure, difficult to read, difficult to understand. But it's at least very clear that he wants to deny premise number 2 here. So it might be helpful to first to question what can be said in favor of premise 2, in favor of this view that pleasure is a becoming. The anti-pleasure arguer seems to have in mind the notion that, or I should say the paradigm case, a kind of image of what the paradigm case of pleasure is. And that is that the paradigm case of pleasure is something like eating or drinking, which of course would be natural to assume coming from the account of incontinence. You could throw in sexual intercourse, the pleasure of sexual intercourse in there as well, although it's I think somewhat clear in the case of eating or drinking, but there's a parallel there. As we all know, eating and drinking have often been considered to be metaphors or analogies to sexual intercourse. But the paradigm is eating and drinking is clearest in this case. So they would say that the arguer against pleasure now, the anti-pleasure arguer, who thinks of pleasure as a process of becoming, they would say that a process of becoming nourished or hydrated is what's going on in eating or drinking. And the good in these cases is the state of being nourished or hydrated, not the process of becoming so. And by a parody of reasoning, by analogy, pleasure is like that. It's pleasure. A pleasure is a becoming to achieve a kind of state that overcomes a lack that a person is experiencing. And so it's not the pleasure itself that's good, but it's the achievement of that state. Now, against this view, Aristotle makes a distinction between kinds of pleasures. And what he wants to say is that there are, or one could say that there are pleasures that are of this type, but they're not proper pleasures. They merely seem to be pleasure because they involve the restoration of our natural state, and thus the removal of a state of deficiency or lack which is experienced as pain. But these, he says, are not true or unqualified pleasures, since they're always relative to some particular state of deficiency that some particular person is in at a particular time. And he proves this by saying that even a painful medical treatment can be experienced by a particular person as a pleasure if it removes an even worse pain. An example of this might be something like a rough massage of a spasming muscle. A massage is very rough by like a sports trainer or someone that is experienced as pleasurable when it's dealing with a spasming muscle. But if someone did that to you when you were just in a normal condition, you would say, "Ow, stop that hurts." So something that would be experienced as painful in a normal condition is experienced as pleasurable in this special circumstance. And what Aristotle is saying is these are not pleasures properly so called because they're not unqualified pleasures. They're just pleasures relative to a particular state of lack or deficiency that is being remedied as we're being returned to our natural state through this process that is in itself neither pleasurable nor painful. It depends on what state you started in. If you started in a state where you have a spasming muscle, then that rough massage is pleasurable. But in other normal circumstances, it wouldn't be. So he says eating and drinking is like that. It's experienced as pleasant only because a painful state of hunger or thirst is being removed. And of course, we know this to be the case. What's experienced as pleasurable when you're hungry would be experienced as painful, disgusting when you're very full. So we don't enjoy the same thing when our nature is being refilled as we enjoy it when it is fully restored, Aristotle says. These are then relative or coincidental pleasures. We can put scare quotes around them. That seems to be the way Aristotle thinks of them. They're not really pleasures, properly so speaking. They're kind of things that give the appearance of pleasure because they involve this restoration of the natural state. But they're purely relative to the state of deficiency that requires such restoration. Now, of course, one could argue that all pleasures are of this relative coincidental sort, and so therefore that is the paradigm of pleasure. That's what pleasure is always like. But here is where Aristotle has a case to make that, in fact, that's not the case. That's not the essence of pleasure, because all pleasures aren't like that. They aren't like this filling up of a state of lack or deficiency. We can see this from the fact that there are some pleasures, and Aristotle's favorite example is the pleasure of studying, the pleasures of learning, that do not match this pattern. The pleasure of studying doesn't depend on lacking something. It's true that we're adding something to our soul, and you could, of course, say, this is knowledge that you lacked. Someone who wasn't going to insist on this theory of pleasure, this pleasure is always a becoming, always a process of filling up, would insist on that. But Aristotle, I think, would point to the fact, although he doesn't do it clearly here, but I think he would point to the fact that it's impossible to say that when we're studying something or learning something, we're fulfilling a lack or a deficiency in the same sense that food, water, and medical treatment fulfill a lack or deficiency. You know, you won't mentally starve to death if you don't complete the Nicomachean ethics. But nonetheless, if you do complete it, if you do study it, you will add something to your soul. So it's not proper to say that studying is filling a lack in this sense. It's an activity that's a pleasure, but that doesn't involve any kind of change of state from a state of lack and deficiency to a state of fulfillment. And this suggests a second type or class of pleasure. Those things that are not relatively pleasant because they involve filling a lack, but rather things that are pleasant, he says, without qualification. Things that are pleasant without qualification. So we have on the one hand these pleasures in a kind of derivative, improper, or secondary sense, which are relative pleasures, which just involve filling a lack. But then we have what's proper pleasure for Aristotle, pleasures, things that are pleasant without qualification. And this interpretation is what leads Aristotle to reject the interpretation of pleasures as processes of becoming. At best, this description of pleasure only applies to pleasures in the relative or qualified sense. And they're relative or qualified in the sense that they depend upon particular persons at particular times being in a state of lack. Yeah, so it's qualified in the sense that we add a qualification to it. We say, well, that's pleasant to you because of the state that you're in. So that macaroni and cheese is pleasant to you because you haven't eaten anything all day, but I find it disgusting. Or that rough sports massage is pleasant to you because you have a spasming muscle, but Mr. Sports Trainer, please stay away from me because you'll just hurt me if you try to massage my muscle in that way. So it's only relative or qualified pleasure because it's relativized to the person or qualified by the phrase to you at this time. But there are pleasures, what he wants to suggest, that are pleasant in an unqualified sense, that are simply pleasant, period, with no qualification. Pleasant in a way that's not relativized to something else. Pleasant in an unqualified sense. So, if pleasure in an unqualified sense is not a becoming, as this argument presupposes, what is it? And Aristotle's response is as follows. This is on page 136, section 3. Further, it is not necessary for something else to be better than pleasure, as the end, some say, is better than the becoming. For pleasures are not becomings, nor do they all even involve a becoming. They are activities and an end in themselves, and arise when we exercise a capacity not when we are coming to be in some state. And not all pleasures have something else as their end, but only those in people who are being led towards the completion of their nature. That is why it is also a mistake to call pleasure a perceived becoming. It should instead be called an activity of the natural state, and should be called not perceived but unimpeded. The reason it seems to some people to be a becoming is that it is fully good and hence an activity, for they think activities are becomings, though in fact they are different things. Here, we should note when he says pleasure should be called an activity of the natural state, not perceived but unimpeded. What he means here in denying that it's perceived is he means perceived in the sense of it's just in the eye of the beholder. It's just relative to your particular perspective given the condition you're in. So it's a relativizing clause that he's mentioning here. It's meant to capture this idea that, well, you perceive that rough sports massage as being pleasant, but that's only because you've got a spasming muscle. That's the perceived aspect of it here. And that can be confusing because, as we'll see later on, perception in the general sense, the sense in which when I sense something or when I think of something or understand something, I'm perceiving. That will be part of his later account of pleasure. So we need to make that point here. I think he's using perceived in different senses here. And he's contrasting it with unimpeded. So an activity that is unimpeded is pleasure in an unqualified sense. He defines pleasure, in other words, here as pleasure is an unimpeded activity of our natural capacities. And I put a little subscript here, pleasure subscript 1, because this is the first of his two main definitions of pleasure that we'll be looking at in the theory, the one that appears in book 7, and we're going to have another one in book 10. So keep that in mind. This is not the final word, it's just the first word on pleasure. But pleasure is he takes the activity view of pleasure that we were considering before as our last option. It's activity, what kind of activity? Unimpeded activity of our natural capacities. Now, the unimpeded activity of a natural capacity seems close to being a description of life itself. And so it isn't surprising that Aristotle calls pleasure so understood as an end in itself. It's not some particular end, some particular specific thing that we pursue in our lives, but it's like life itself. It's an end in itself, like living itself. It's not for something else, because everything else has to ultimately come back to this reference point of the activity of our natural capacities in general. So pleasure, in this sense, has a very broad scope. As the unimpeded activity of our natural capacities, it's going to be something that has a kind of default goodness to it, because it's an end that is the condition of all other ends. It's an end in itself, to have unimpeded activity of our natural capacities. Everything else, in a sense, that we do is going to depend on that to some degree. So then, is Aristotle saying that all pleasure is good? Yes and no. There is, of course, a sense in which pleasures can be bad. I mean, that's quite clear. We've seen repeatedly in the Nicomachean ethics so far that Aristotle isn't going to deny that some pleasures are in some sense bad. But to say that a pleasure is bad is merely to say that sometimes pleasures run opposed to other good things. In Aristotle's example, he says, healthy things can be opposed to money-making, or study can be harmful to health. healthy things can be opposed to money making. I don't know exactly what he has in mind here. I need to take a break from my job as a stockbroker so I can, take an afternoon run or whatever to maintain my health, leave the trading floor. Or maybe, you think about how eating healthy can often be more expensive, at least in America, than eating it in an unhealthy way. You can buy a lot of, high carb, high sugar foods for cheaper than you can buy arugula or something like that. So healthy things can be opposed to money making. Or even, he says, study can be harmful to health. If you get so into studying that you neglect your personal care, it can be harmful to health. So it's not that pleasures are bad in themselves, but that certain pleasures are opposed to other good things that should override them. And so even though every pleasure in itself is in a sense good, they should be overridden by other greater goods. That seems to be the idea. Thus, Aristotle concludes that it is only pleasures that are relative qualified pleasures that are not necessarily good. Unqualified pleasures, such as study, are good without qualification, even though each one of these may have to be balanced and coordinated with other pleasures. In chapter 13, Aristotle goes on to argue that if pleasure is an unimpeded activity, and there is a most choice-worthy activity, then the pleasure that is the unimpeded activity of this type would certainly be a good, and even might be the best good. And this explains, he thinks, why the happy life is thought to be a pleasant life. Because people understand that pleasure involves unimpeded activity, and if happiness or the happy life is the most choice-worthy activity, then pleasure that's unimpeded activity of this type would be a good. Finally, in the first discussion of pleasure, Aristotle takes up the position of someone who might concede that finer activities, such as discussing philosophy, might indeed be a pleasure that's choice-worthy, but who would at the same time deny that bodily pleasures can be good. Against this view, Aristotle first notes that everyone agrees that bodily pains are evil, and that what is contrary to an evil is a good. And this would tend to point to bodily pleasures being a good as well. Of course, bodily pleasures might be good merely in the sense that they're not evil. This would be a restricted sense in which they're good, insofar as they are avoiding an evil, namely pains. Aristotle, as we've already seen in his discussion of temperance, doesn't take this view, however. He allows that bodily pleasures are good in themselves, but only up to a point, after which they become excessive. Aristotle acknowledges that bodily pleasures appear more choice-worthy to most people than the finer pleasures, and he believes that any theory of pleasure that wants to hold our conviction must explain this fact. Why is it that most people seem to prefer bodily pleasures to the finer pleasures, like studying philosophy? Whatever kind of account of pleasure we're going to give, he says we're going to have to explain why this is. Why is it that most people have this preference? Well, he gives a complex explanation for this. In some cases, it's due to the fact that a person with this opinion, that it's better to eat Cheetos and drink beer than study philosophy or whatever, it may be that this person simply has a base nature. Or it may be that because bodily pleasures are intense, a person who's too coarse and incapable of being affected by anything except for intense pleasures can only recognize the intense pleasures. Also, many bodily pleasures result from the driving out or curing of a contrary pain. We've already considered examples of this. And a restoration of a natural state or state of health. And so people who are sickly and always requiring a cure will naturally gravitate to such pleasures. And that may include even the majority of people. Certainly in Aristotle's day, where people tended to be less healthy than today. Aristotle also hints at the belief that he has that because human beings are embodied and our bodies are always changing, we are habitually prone to needing to have our state of natural equilibrium restored, to have our natural balance restored. And that involves pleasant cures of various sorts. And this will make us susceptible to various types of bodily pleasures. This human state of mutability is in contrast to the state of the gods. And thus we can see that the sorts of pleasures that are suitable to the divine state are going to be different from the typical pleasures that human beings gravitate to. But at the same time, if we as human beings could attain those divine pleasures that do not require variation and change, this might be something that would be desirable for us to seek. And I think, as we'll see, he's anticipating a bit here the end of Book 10 in his final account of happiness. So, Section 8, page 140 in chapter 14 of Book 7. The reason why no one thing is always pleasant is that our nature is not simple, but has more than one constituent insofar as we are perishable. Hence, the action of one part is against nature for the other nature in us, and when they are equally balanced, the action seems neither pleasant nor painful. For if something has a simple nature, the same action will always be pleasantest. That is why the God always enjoys one simple pleasure without change. For activity belongs not only to change, but also to unchangingness. And indeed, there is pleasure in rest than in change. Note that point. In Aristotle's conception of activity, activity doesn't involve change, which might seem false to us. We might think that if there's any activity that's going on, there must be change. But Aristotle's saying, well, if the activity is just maintaining its same form, just cycling, as it were, it's not necessarily changing in his sense of change, because it's not varying. There's no varying. There's no change. That seems to be what he's saying. And so the God engages in an activity that doesn't change because it doesn't vary, and that's in contrast to the typical state of human beings. For activity belongs not only to change, but also in unchangingness. And indeed, there is pleasure in rest more than in change. Variation in everything is sweet, as the poet says, but because of some inferiority. So this is a kind of a poetic dictum, kind of proverb. Variation is, it's good to have variety. We say variety is the spice of life. And Aristotle says, this isn't a divine way of thinking. It's only because of an inferiority that human beings think this way. For just as it is the inferior human being who is prone to variation, so also the nature that needs variation is inferior, since it is not simple or decent. So there's a kind of account of why it is people think that these bodily pleasures are better. The bodily pleasures are the ones that suit our varying nature as human beings who are embodied and therefore perishable. But that is an inferiority, Aristotle would say. And so we can, at the one hand, we can hold these two views at the same time. The view that for the majority, bodily pleasures are superior to mental pleasures, or we would say spiritual pleasures, like discussing philosophy. But that's because of the inferiority of their nature, which is our human nature, which involves change and variability. Okay, so that's basically the account of pleasure that we get at the end of Book 7, the first account, or the first half of his complete account, if indeed the discussion of friendship can be read as a kind of digression in his account of pleasure. So let's pause at this point to ask the first discussion question. First discussion question. Does it make sense to you to conceive of pleasure as an unimpeded activity of a natural capacity? Why or why not? Does a pleasant life require the sort of bodily change and variation that also must necessarily include the experience of pains? Or would it be more desirable, if it were possible, to live an unvarying, godlike existence, enjoying one single changeless activity? Explain your answer. So, first discussion question once again. Does it make sense to you to conceive of pleasure as unimpeded activity of a natural capacity? Why or why not? Does a pleasant life require the sort of bodily change and variation that also must necessarily include the experience of pains? Or would it be more desirable, if it were possible, to live an unvarying, godlike existence enjoying one single changeless activity? Explain your answer. Okay, so we skip over the account of friendship that we have just covered in the two previous videos to the beginning of Book 10, the final book of the Nicomachean Ethics. At the beginning of Book 10, following the long discussion of friendship, Aristotle takes up the topic of pleasure once more. It is indeed puzzling that he brings up the topic without any clear sign that he discussed the topic earlier. The first chapter discusses or justifies the concern for pleasure by appeal to the importance of pleasure for a happy life. Again, similar considerations are mentioned as in the first discussion, the importance of pleasure and pain and virtue and vice and its role in the happy life. And likewise, once again, disputes over whether pleasure is the good or even a good are once again mentioned. And this time, various previously unmentioned philosophical arguments are considered, as well as a version of the argument we talked about earlier. Once again, Aristotle shows himself to be resistant both to the view that pleasure is simply the good and to the view that it's not even a good. So the extreme positions Aristotle rejects. So he's reluctant to say with the philosopher Eudoxus that pleasure is simply the good. Yet at the same time, he rejects the position of those who would deny that pleasure is a good. He offers new considerations against the view that pleasure can't be a good because it is a process and a becoming. Once again, denying that it's either of these things, because it has features that seem incompatible with being either. So, for example, he says a process can be quick or slow, but that doesn't seem to apply to pleasure. You could dispute that potentially, but that's one of his arguments. I don't want to dwell too much on that. And once again, he makes the argument that not all pleasures are like eating, which seems to involve the diminishing of a pain as the body is refilled. He says the pleasures of mathematics and perception are not like that. Rather than side completely with those who say that pleasure is not a good at all, Aristotle tries to accommodate the underlying phenomena that he thinks are really driving such arguments and such negative attitudes towards pleasure. So it seems that people are driven to reject pleasure as bad because they notice that some of the sources of pleasure are shameful. And this can involve either what we might call, using modern terminology, subjective or objective sources. So on the subjective side, one might think that pleasures are bad by identifying pleasure as the source of the viciousness of bad people. However, things so identified, doing hard drugs or prostitution, for example, these things may not be real pleasures at all in themselves, but merely appear so to bad people. So on 185, section 8, he says, to those who cite the disgraceful pleasures to show that pleasure is not a good, we might reply that these sources of disgraceful pleasures are not pleasant. For if things are healthy or sweet or bitter to sick people, we should not suppose that they are also healthy or sweet or bitter, except to them. Or that things appearing white to people with eye disease are white, except to them. Similarly, if things are pleasant to people in bad condition, we should not suppose that they are also pleasant, except to these people. Here, Aristotle is really reintroducing an important consideration from his discussion way back in the discussion of action and wishing as an element of action, in which he had said that it's a characteristic of vicious people that the things that they wish for, the things that appear good to them, are not really good. And here he's making the same point about pleasures. Vicious people who enjoy things like hard drugs or engaging in prostitution are not people who are in a good condition. And so the fact that they have the ability to derive pleasure from these things doesn't mean that they are pleasurable in themselves. On the other hand, sometimes people might come to think that certain pleasures are harmful, but only because people have a tendency to acquire them through shameful sources, like people who cheat or defraud in order to get wealthy, or who eat disgusting things for the sake of health, right? Some kind of like seaweed shake or something like that, for the sake of their health. So the key thing, therefore, seems to be to seek the real objective pleasures and only from good sources. That's the point. It doesn't. The fact that people may seek health from eating disgusting food, disgusting sources, or that they may seek wealth from bad sources like cheating or defrauding, doesn't mean that wealth or health are bad. It just means that you shouldn't seek them from a bad source. So if we seek real objective pleasures from good sources, there's no problem. That seems to be Aristotle's position. He lays down this basic position in section 13, page 186. Oops. Okay, strike that. I have the wrong citation here. I'm not sure what I was thinking of when I was writing these notes. In chapter 4 of book 10, Aristotle once again takes up the basic issue of the nature of pleasure itself. So, what is pleasure? Back to that question. And first, Aristotle establishes some facts about pleasure. He says pleasure is complete at every time it exists, it's whole, and it is uniform. Complete at every time it exists, whole and uniform. And this implies that it's not a process, because a process extends over time and it's never complete at any particular time when it exists. So, for example, constructing a building is a process. There would be a paradigm of a process, constructing a building. But constructing a building is never complete while it exists as a process. Of course, the building, hopefully, is completed, but once that happens, the process goes out of existence. There is no more constructing a building once the building is complete. So the process is always going to be incomplete, but pleasure is complete. That's what he says. Pleasure is always, it's like seeing, he says, you see something, you see it, it's complete, it's not incomplete. A process always has parts, but a pleasure is a whole. So constructing a building has the parts, laying the foundation, putting on the roof. But there aren't parts of a pleasure. A pleasure is just a whole. And processes differ in form, he says. So he talks about the process of locomotion, which includes flying, walking, jumping. But pleasure has a kind of uniform character to it. So instead of a process, as I already mentioned, he compares it to seeing, which is complete and whole at each time it exists. This, of course, refutes this common philosophical view that pleasure is some sort of becoming, because becoming is a kind of process. So this involves a negation of the view of pleasure as a becoming as well. Now, following these opening remarks, chapter 4, distinguishing pleasure from a process, Aristotle abruptly shifts to discussing perceptual capacities. Perceptual capacities. He says, Perceptual capacities are always active in relation to its perceptible object. So, perceptual capacities are active in relation to their objects. I suppose we naturally think here as an example of sight and seeing. Aristotle's already mentioned that. So the capacity is sight. Seeing is the activity of that capacity. And its object is a visible thing. And seeing is active in relation to the visible thing that is its objects. And such activities can be evaluated as better or worse. So, for example, you can see clearly or see dimly. There's better or worse seeing, better or worse activity. So these are two important points he makes about perceptual capacities. They're active in relation to their objects, and these activities can always be evaluated as better or worse. Aristotle lays it down as a principle, section 5, page 187, that, quote, for each capacity, the best activity is the activity of the subject in the best condition in relation to the best object of the capacity, unquote. For each capacity, the best activity is the activity of the subject in the best condition in relation to the best object of the capacity. So that is how we would evaluate the activity of a capacity in relation to the standard that's set by the best subject of the capacity, the best subject that's exercising the capacity in relation to the best object of the capacity. That would be the best activity. And the definition of pleasure then follows this. It's at the bottom of 187. For every perceptual capacity and every sort of study has its pleasure. The pleasantest activity is the most complete, and the most complete activity is the activity of the subject in good condition in relation to the most excellent object of the capacity. Pleasure completes the activity. So this is the second account of pleasure. Second account is the complete activity or the completion of the subject in good condition in relation to the most excellent object of the capacity. And the capacity that act is of. So this is a much longer one. The complete activity or the completion of the activity of the subject in good condition in relation to the most excellent object of the capacity that activity, we'll say, concerns. So pleasure is the complete activity or the completion of the activity of the subject in good condition in relation to the most excellent object of the capacity that that activity concerns. Now, how is this account of pleasure related to the previous one? It's both related to it, and yet it also goes beyond the earlier account in Book 7. There, pleasure was identified with any unimpeded activity. Here, pleasure is once again identified with an activity, and this is why I kind of changed around the wording there, and I said the complete activity instead of the completion of the activity, because I think this is ambiguous. Completion here means something like the perfection of the activity, in the sense in which you might say, of a famous athlete or something like that, like Tiger Woods' performance at the Open was the perfection of golfing. By which you mean, his activity there was a representative of perfect golfing. That's the idea of the completion of the activity. Of course, we can also think of completion here as finishing, right? Finishing the activity. But that's not what Aristotle means, because that, of course, goes against this idea that the pleasure is a kind of state, which isn't what he wants to say. It's actually an activity. So it's a perfect activity, the perfect instance of that activity, a flawless activity, like a Olympic gymnast who gets a perfect 10. That activity was perfect. That's the sense. So earlier when he identified pleasure with an activity, it was an unimpeded activity, and here it's most complete activity. And that sounds like a difference, but on reflection, that in itself is not a major difference. An unimpeded activity on the one hand and a complete activity. Since for an activity to be unimpeded might actually seem to be close to the idea of having nothing taken away from it. And that might be described as being complete. For example, the activity of seeing is impeded by the absence of sufficient light. But this very condition of being impeded by partial darkness can also be described as incomplete seeing. Right? We can see the outlines of objects in a room in partial darkness, but not their colors or their details. And this self-same fact could be described either as our seeing being impeded or as our seeing being incomplete. We can see the outlines, we can't see the details. We have impeded seeing, or we have a seeing that's incomplete. So that by itself isn't that big of a difference from the earlier account, arguably. However, there are two significant differences from Aristotle's previous account, and these involve a narrowing of the previous account. First, he goes on to restrict these explicitly to perceptual activities. So the account but the way, continue on from the definition there in 188, but the way in which pleasure completes the activity is not the way in which the perceptual object and the perceptual capacity complete it when they are both excellent. He says, clearly a pleasure arises that corresponds to each perceptual capacity. So the complete activity of the subject, it seems like we need to add here to this definition that this is a perceptual activity, or an activity of perception. The complete perceptual activity of the subject. Pleasure is explicitly restricted here to perceptual activity, so the 5 forms of sensing as well as the various forms of thinking. And second, pleasure is now identified by the object of the perceptual activity. We've already seen that here. This idea of the most excellent object that I just circled there. the most excellent object of a perceptual activity is the pleasure. To see intuitively what Aristotle might be thinking of here, consider seeing once again. Seeing is unimpeded and complete seeing when there is sufficient light, we said. But seeing is not a pleasure merely when there is sufficient light to see everything in one's surroundings. Yet all would agree that seeing is sometimes a pleasure. When is that? When is seeing a pleasure? Under what conditions is seeing a pleasure? And an answer immediately suggests itself. Seeing is a pleasure when its object is fine or beautiful. But that is indeed, as Aristotle says, the most excellent object to be seen. This seems to be the reasoning behind Aristotle's theory of pleasure. Aristotle says pleasure completes the activity. But this must not be understood in the sense in which the attainment of a certain state of completeness completes a process of becoming. As I said earlier, it's not like, for example, the way in which the rising of a loaf of bread completes the baking. It's not like that. Rather, he compares it here to the bloom on youths in a famous sentence of chapter 4. This is section 8, page 188. Pleasure completes the activity, not, however, as the state does by being present in the activity, but as the sort of supervenient end, like the bloom on youths. A blooming youth is a youth who has reached a certain state of perfection in his appearance. Pleasure, therefore, completes the activity by perfecting the activity. The unimpeded and perceptive seeing of a beautiful form is perfect seeing. That's the sense in which it's complete. The unimpeded and perceptive hearing of a lovely sound is perfect hearing. The unimpeded and perceptive tasting of a gourmet meal is perfect tasting, and so on. That's what pleasure is, he wants to say. Aristotle once again goes on to connect pleasure with being alive. We might say that pleasure as perfected activity is being perfectly alive, being fully alive. It's being alive in the most perfect sense or to the greatest degree. Given that pleasure perfects the activity, it's not surprising, as Aristotle also notes, that it increases the activity. This is in chapter 5 now. As human beings, we are imperfect. None of us can do all the activities that we do perfectly all the time. Thus, when the occasion arises that we can engage in an activity perfectly, or even nearly perfectly, we naturally tend to want to continue in that activity. We focus all our attention on that activity, as Aristotle notes there at 189, center of the page, section 2. For the proper pleasure increases the activity, for we judge each thing better and more exactly when our activity involves pleasure. If, for instance, we enjoy doing geometry, we become better geometers and understand each question better. And similarly, lovers of music, building, and so on improve at their proper function when they enjoy it. Each pleasure increases the activity. What increases it is proper to it. And since the activities are different in species, what is proper to them is also different in species. This is even more apparent from the fact that some activities are impeded by pleasures from other activities. For lovers of flutes, for instance, cannot pay attention to a conversation if they catch the sound of someone playing the flute, because they enjoy flute playing more than their present activity. And so the pleasure proper to flute playing destroys the activity of conversation. The same is true in other cases also, whenever we are engaged in two activities at once, for the pleasanter activity pushes out the other one. All the more if it is much, much pleasanter, so that we no longer even engage in the other activity. We can now perhaps see why Aristotle's fuller account of pleasure was left until after his account of friendship and the relation of friendship to the complete achievement of the human good. Pleasure for Aristotle is the perfection of the activities of perception and thought. The perfection of perception and thought is determined by the object of those activities. The most perfect activities of perception and thought are those which are engaged with the most perfect object of perception and thought. But what is the most perfect object to perceive or to think about? What or who is the most perfect object to perceive or think about? Well, the answer has just been provided in Book 9. It's the friend. The friend is the most perfect object to perceive or to think about. Thus, after Book 9, we have before us a plausible example. We have on the table, as it were, a plausible example that confirms Aristotle's account of pleasure. This second account of pleasure here. And it also renders plausible his view that the greatest pleasures are not the pleasures involved in satisfying the appetites, like a mere grazing animal. Rather, the greatest pleasure exists in and through the greatest form of virtuous activity, which are the activities that constitute the true virtuous friendship. In the end, Aristotle claims that pleasures are distinct to each species, and there's a proper pleasure for each species that corresponds to its proper function. So we get a kind of connection here of the counter pleasure with the function argument at long last. Section 8 on page 190, the bottom. Each species of animal seems to have its own proper pleasure, just as it has its own proper function, for the proper pleasure will be the one that corresponds to its activity. This is apparent if we also study each kind, for a horse, a dog, and a human being have different pleasures. And as Heraclitus says, an ass would choose chaff over gold, since asses find food pleasanter than gold. Hence, animals that differ in species also have different pleasures that differ in species. And it would be reasonable for animals of the same species to have the same pleasures also. The proper pleasure of humans, of course, is what appears most pleasant to the virtuous person. It's the virtuous person who's the standard of what's really pleasant in itself. So in sections 10 and the beginning of 11, page 191. But in all such cases, it seems that what really is so is what appears so to the virtuous person. If this is right, as it seems to be, and virtue, i.e. the good person insofar as he is good, is the measure of each thing, virtue is the measure of each thing, then what appears pleasures to him will also really be pleasures, and what is pleasant will be what he enjoys. And if what he finds objectionable appears pleasant to someone, that is not at all surprising, for human beings suffer many sorts of corruption and damage. It is not pleasant, however, except to those people in these conditions. Clearly, then, we should say that the pleasures agreed to be shameful are not pleasures at all, except to corrupted people. This leads to our second discussion question. Does it make sense to conceive of the best human pleasures as the perfection or completion of the distinctively human activities of perception and thought? Why or why not? In the end, does Aristotle succeed in demonstrating that the most pleasant life and the most virtuous life are one and the same? Why or why not? Second discussion question. Does it make sense to conceive of the best human pleasures as the perfection or completion of the distinctively human activities of perception and thought? Why or why not? In the end, does Aristotle succeed in demonstrating that the most pleasant life and the most virtuous life are one and the same thing? Why or why not?